You're standing in a field. It's 10,000 BC. The sun is beating down on the back of your neck. There's no grocery store. There's no refrigerator. There's no existential dread about whether the avocados are ripe yet. There's just you, the dirt, and a patch of wild grass swaying in the wind. And somewhere, at some point, one of your ancestors looked at that grass and thought, wait, what if I did that on purpose? This is the story of how humans discovered farming. Not supermarkets, not industrial agriculture, not the guy at the farmer's market charging $14 for a jar of artisanal honey. We're talking about the very first time a human being intentionally put a seed in the ground and waited. And why that might be one of the most consequential decisions our species has ever made. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you. Farming doesn't start with a plan. It doesn't start with a vision or a committee meeting or someone waking up one morning and saying, you know what, I'm done chasing antelope. The shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture was so slow, so gradual, so invisible to the people actually living through it that no single human being in history ever knew they were inventing farming. They were just doing what made sense that day, and that is genuinely one of the most profound things about it. Because here's the truth nobody says out loud. For most of human history, farming would have looked absolutely insane to anyone watching. Why would you stay in one place and do backbreaking labor every day when you could just walk somewhere else and find food that already grew itself? The honest answer is complicated, and the full story of how it happened is stranger and more fascinating than anything you learned in school. Let's start at the very beginning, because before you can grow anything, you need humans who have been around long enough to notice patterns. And modern humans, Homo sapiens, have been around for roughly 300,000 years. 300,000 years. Agriculture, in its earliest recognizable form, is maybe 12,000 years old. That means for approximately 96% of our existence as a species, we didn't farm. We hunted, we gathered, we followed herds, we moved with the seasons, we ate what the world offered us, and we moved on when it stopped offering it. And here's the part that should actually surprise you. Archaeologists and anthropologists who study hunter-gatherer societies, both ancient ones and the few that persisted into the modern era, have found something deeply inconvenient for the narrative of progress. Hunter-gatherers, on average, worked less than farmers. A lot less. Studies of modern and recent hunter-gatherer groups suggest they typically spent somewhere between 3 and 5 hours a day acquiring food. The rest of the time was spent resting, socializing, making things, telling stories, doing the rich and varied business of being alive. Early farmers, by contrast, worked from dawn to dusk, broke their bodies, and often ate a less nutritionally diverse diet than the people who came before them. The skeletons of early agricultural populations show increased rates of dental decay, nutritional deficiencies, and joint damage compared to the hunter-gatherers who preceded them. So the obvious question is, why did anyone bother? Why would you trade a relatively leisurely existence for the hard, grinding, back-breaking labor of agriculture? The answer, as with most things in human history, is that nobody made a clean trade. Nobody chose farming over hunting. Farming crept in at the edges of an existing life and slowly, over centuries and millennia, became the life itself. And by the time anyone could have noticed the shift, it was already too late to go back. Now, let's talk about where this all actually happened, because the story of farming's origins is one of the most remarkable stories in all of human history, for one specific reason. It didn't happen once, it happened independently, in multiple places, at roughly similar times, by people who had absolutely no contact with each other. This is called independent invention, and when it happens with a behavior this complex and this consequential, it tells you something deep about the conditions that produce it. The most famous origin point is a region of the Middle East called the Fertile Crescent. This is a sweeping arc of land running from what is now southern Turkey down through Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and into Iraq, roughly following the courses of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Around 10,000 BC, in this region, people began deliberately cultivating wild grasses, specifically the ancestors of wheat and barley. They also began domesticating animals, goats first, then sheep, then cattle, then pigs. This combination, crops plus livestock, is the foundation of what we call the Neolithic Revolution, the new Stone Age Revolution, the moment when the human relationship with the natural world fundamentally shifted from taking to making. But while the Fertile Crescent was doing its thing, something equally remarkable was happening on the other side of the planet. In China, around 7,000 to 9,000 BC, people in the Yellow River Valley were independently domesticating millet. People in the Yangtze River Valley were independently domesticating rice. Same time period, different crops, different people. No contact whatsoever. Then, in Mesoamerica, in what is now southern Mexico, around 9,000 years ago, people were independently domesticating maize, not wheat, not rice, maize, a plant that looks so different from its wild ancestor that for most of the 20th century, scientists couldn't even figure out what it had been domesticated from. In New Guinea, roughly 7,000 years ago, people were independently developing agriculture based on root crops like taro. In sub-Saharan Africa, people were independently domesticating sorghum and African rice. In the eastern United States, people were independently cultivating sunflowers, chenopodium, and squash. At least 6, possibly more, completely independent origins of agriculture. Different continents, different climates, different plants, same basic idea, all emerging within a relatively narrow window of time in the geological and evolutionary sense, all clustering around the period between 12,000 and 5,000 years ago, when something happens independently that many times, in that many places, at roughly the same moment in history. It's not a coincidence. Something changed that made farming not just possible, but almost inevitable. And figuring out what that something was is one of the most interesting puzzles in all of archaeology. The answer almost certainly begins with climate, because 12,000 years ago, something enormous happened to the Earth. The last ice age ended. The Pleistocene gave way to the Holocene. Massive ice sheets that had covered large portions of North America, Europe, and Asia retreated. Global temperatures rose, rainfall patterns shifted, ecosystems transformed almost overnight in geological terms. The megafauna that hunter-gatherers had been relying on for tens of thousands of years, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, a whole bestiary of enormous animals that had been a primary protein source for human populations worldwide, began going extinct in rapid succession. Whether this was caused primarily by climate change or by human hunting pressure, or some combination of both, is a debate that still rages in archaeology, but the outcome was not debated. By 10,000 years ago, these large prey animals were gone or going. The buffet was closing, and humans, faced with declining returns from hunting, had to make adjustments. At the same time, the warmer, wetter, more stable climate of the Holocene was producing conditions in which wild plants were growing in greater abundance and density than they had during the Ice Age. Wild grain fields became larger and richer. The caloric math of gathering started looking better than it had before. And here is the key insight that most people miss when they think about the origins of farming. The first farmers were not ignorant people who stumbled across a new idea. They were the inheritors of hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about plants. Hunter-gatherers knew their local plant life with an intimacy that would put most modern botanists to shame. They knew which plants were edible and which were toxic. They knew where they grew, when they fruited, how they reproduced. They knew that if you dropped seeds near a water source, things tended to grow there the following season. They had been watching the plant world with the attention of people whose lives depended on that watching, because their lives literally did depend on it. So when people in the Fertile Crescent began deliberately harvesting and replanting wild wheat around 10,000 BC, they weren't inventing something out of nothing. They were applying knowledge that had been accumulating for a very long time to a new set of pressures and opportunities. The invention of farming was not a sudden discovery. It was a very slow application of very old intelligence to a changed world. Now here's where we have to talk about a specific site, because there is one place in the archaeological record that might just rewrite everything you think you know about why farming started. In southeastern Turkey, there is a hill called Göbekli Tepe, and what archaeologists found there beginning in the 1990s is genuinely one of the most extraordinary discoveries in the history of the discipline. Göbekli Tepe contains massive stone pillars, carved with elaborate reliefs of animals arranged in circular enclosures. Some of these pillars are 18 feet tall and weigh up to 20 tons. The site dates to approximately 11,600 years ago, which means it is older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years, older than the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years, older than any other known monumental construction in the world. And here is the thing that makes Göbekli Tepe so disruptive to the conventional story of farming. It was built by hunter-gatherers, pre-agricultural people who had not yet, as far as we can tell, domesticated crops or animals. They were mobile or semi-mobile. They lived by hunting and gathering, and yet they built this massive, sophisticated, clearly deeply intentional ritual complex in the middle of the hills of what is now Turkey, which raises an immediate and obvious question. How? How do you organize the labor required to quarry, transport, and erect 20-ton stone pillars without agriculture to feed the workforce? How do you coordinate that many people without the surplus food production that we always assumed was the prerequisite for complex society? The traditional model of human civilization went roughly like this. First farming, then food surplus, then settled villages, then specialized labor, then complex society, then monumental architecture, then religion and ritual. That was the sequence. That was the ladder. Göbekli Tepe knocked that ladder over and set it on fire, because here was monumental ritual architecture that clearly required massive social coordination, clearly represented sophisticated belief systems, clearly was the product of a complex society built by people who had not yet made the transition to agriculture. Some researchers, most notably the archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who spent decades excavating the site, proposed that the sequence might actually run in reverse. Not farming first, then ritual, but ritual first, then farming. The idea is this: if you are building something like Göbekli Tepe, if you are gathering hundreds of people in one place to quarry stone and raise pillars and maintain a ritual complex, you have a feeding problem. You need to supply calories to a large, concentrated, relatively stationary workforce. The pressure to produce food on a larger, more reliable, more intensive scale than normal foraging might be the thing that drove the development of agriculture in the first place. Not hunger, not the end of the megafauna, not a eureka moment about seeds, but the organizational demands of ritual, of religion, of the deep human need to gather together and do something that doesn't have any immediately practical purpose. That is a genuinely radical idea, that the oldest human impulses, the ones toward the sacred, toward collective meaning, toward building something larger than your own survival, may be the actual engine that drove the agricultural revolution. Göbekli Tepe doesn't prove this, but it makes it a serious conversation, and that alone is remarkable. Let's talk about the actual mechanics of domestication, because this part of the story is deeply strange and almost nobody understands it correctly. When we say that ancient humans domesticated wheat, we don't mean they put wheat in cages and trained it to sit. Domestication in plants is a process of unconscious selection. It happens when humans preferentially harvest and replant plants that have traits useful to humans, even without any intention to change the plant's biology. Wild wheat has a very useful evolutionary adaptation. When it's ripe, the seed head shatters, scattering seeds in all directions. This is great for the plant's reproduction. It is absolutely terrible for a human trying to harvest it. If the seed head shatters the moment you touch it, you can't effectively collect the grain. But occasionally, by random genetic mutation, an individual wheat plant would have a seed head that didn't shatter. That didn't scatter when touched. A human harvesting wheat would naturally, automatically, without any thought about genetics or selective breeding, collect more grain from the plants that didn't scatter. Then they'd plant some of that grain for next season. Then the next generation of plants would have a slightly higher proportion of the non-shattering trait. Then they'd harvest again. Then they'd plant again. Over hundreds of generations, purely through this accidental selective feedback loop, wild wheat became domestic wheat, a plant that cannot reproduce without human assistance because its seeds no longer scatter, a plant that we created without knowing we were creating it. And wheat did the same thing to us, because farming wheat required us to stay near the fields to tend them. Staying in one place required building structures. Building structures led to settlements. Settlements created new pressures around food storage, food defense, population density, disease transmission, social hierarchy. Agriculture and the humans who practiced it co-evolved, each shaping the other in ways that neither party could have anticipated. We domesticated the plants. The plants, in a very real sense, domesticated us. That reciprocal transformation, that feedback loop running in both directions simultaneously, is the actual engine of the Neolithic revolution. Not human genius, not a single decisive moment, just 10,000 years of farmers and crops changing each other, generation by generation, in ways too small to see from the inside. There's an uncomfortable dimension to this story that rarely gets enough attention. The invention of farming was not an unambiguous triumph. For a very long time, in popular imagination and in school curricula, farming was presented as a straightforwardly good thing. Progress, advancement, the step that made civilization possible. And in some ways, that's true. Without agriculture, there are no cities. Without cities, there is no writing, no science, no recorded music, no accumulated knowledge, no internet, no any of the things that define modern human life. Agriculture is the foundation of everything that followed, but the lived experience of the transition for the humans actually going through it was frequently brutal. The early agricultural populations of the Fertile Crescent show clear evidence in their skeletons of what this transition cost. Decreased height, a reliable marker of nutritional stress compared to the hunter-gatherers who preceded them. Increased rates of tooth decay because grain-heavy diets are high in carbohydrates. Evidence of iron deficiency, evidence of vitamin deficiencies, evidence of new infectious diseases that jump from the domesticated animals living in close proximity to humans. Measles, smallpox, influenza, the common cold, all of these diseases are products of the agricultural revolution. They moved from animal populations to human populations when humans started keeping large numbers of animals in confined spaces and living cheek by jowl with them in settled villages. The very revolution that eventually made modern medicine possible first created the disease landscape that made modern medicine necessary. And then there's the political dimension. Hunter-gatherer societies are remarkably egalitarian by the standards of what came later. When you're mobile, when you can only own what you can carry, when food surplus is impossible to store for long, it's very difficult to accumulate the kind of wealth that creates permanent class differences. Agriculture made surplus possible. Surplus made storage possible. Storage made it possible for the first time in human history for one person to own meaningfully more than another person. And where there is ownership, there is eventually the protection of ownership, which means hierarchy, which means power. The first farmers didn't know they were also inventing inequality. They were just trying to get enough food for winter. But the systems that grew from the seed they planted ended up producing not just wheat and barley, but pharaohs and emperors, landlords and serfs. A whole vast architecture of human social stratification that we are still living inside today. The agricultural revolution is the root system of almost every social structure that has ever existed. It is the reason we have governments and armies and tax collectors and banks. All of it ultimately is downstream from the decision to stay in one place and tend a field. Let's also talk about something that almost never comes up in the standard history of farming: women. The evidence from multiple lines of inquiry, skeletal analysis, ethnographic comparison, ancient art, early written records suggest strongly that the development of plant knowledge and the early practice of what would become agriculture was predominantly the domain of women in most early human societies. In hunter-gatherer societies that have been studied ethnographically, women are typically responsible for the gathering portion of the economy. They are the ones with detailed knowledge of plant distributions, ripening times, propagation behavior. They are the ones who would first notice that seeds dropped near the campsite grew into new plants. They are the ones whose daily practical activities most closely resemble what early farming actually looked like. The image of the heroic male farmer striding across a field in the origin stories of civilization is largely a retrospective construction, applied backward onto a history in which the foundational knowledge and practice probably looked quite different. The development of agriculture was not a dramatic masculine conquest of nature. It was more likely the slow, patient, generational accumulation of botanical knowledge by people who had been paying close attention to plants for a very long time. That reframing matters not just for historical accuracy, but because it changes what kind of achievement the agricultural revolution actually was. It was not a sudden breakthrough by a lone genius. It was the flowering of accumulated collective knowledge, held in the minds and hands and daily practices of millions of ordinary people across thousands of years. That is actually a more impressive story.